Cheaton! It's Cheaton! Cheaton. How are you doing, Cheaton?
Hi, Daniel. I'm fine. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well now that I've seen you. I'm doing very well, sir. How's life? How's work? How's learning? How's teaching? How's saving mankind?
Life's good. Going on. You know.
Very
How about
good.
you?
Oh,
What
good.
you
This
going
is
to do?
wedding season, so every weekend is
Oh,
a good
you must
time.
be like.
This weekend we have two, and luckily so far, we tend to have good families, like really good families, good brides and groom, different things. So that's been nice, and so October through December, so we're doing all that and getting the tomatoes down because I think they're dead now. But it's pretty outside. This time of year is very nice, so we're doing all well, G Tom. Thank you for asking, sir.
Really fun.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. And Javier, how are you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. Busy.
Yeah, I tell you what.
Basically.
So what you been so what revelations have you gained from class lately, Javier?
I think English class has been my biggest revelation.
That you
You
don't
know,
know English? You're like, I don't know English. Oh, shoot.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny because I was actually thinking about, was it we've been learning about rhetoric, rhetorical awareness, rhetorical situation, which I thought was actually a very good example of like the reason why, as apophatic subjects or like God can be such a difficult thing is actually when you actually have like a personal relation, and this kind of like happens in rhetoric all the time, it's actually more ambiguous.
Mm.
That's the thing, right? When you first introduce yourself to somebody, it's you have to get very detailed, like, hi, I'm Javier from your class, like nice, was wondering if you want to go to the coffee, so on, right? But if you already know the person, it's kind of like, hey, I'm at the coffee place, like meet you there, right? So there seems to be like when we talk about things that we know or like God, for example, I thought it was fascinating that, when mystics talk about God, they seem to always have like an ambiguous rhetoric going on, right? So there's like this rhetorical awareness, rhetorical situation that sort of I thought was actually pretty enlightening. Why is God typically, perceived as a sort of personal being? And I thought the ambiguity actually proves its personability, in my opinion.
Mm.
At least, this is what English class is actually teaching me, right? I'm here learning like how to write, but I'm going like, oh, this is actually fascinating. Like, of course, nobody's making that connection in my class because they're just like, all right, this is English 101. I just want to on with my life.
Meanwhile, Javier is standing up and it's like, guys, do you understand the philosophical significance of periods? And the teacher's like, Javier, it's the fifth time this week. You need to sit down. You need to freaking sit down. And Dimitri, good to see you, sir. You said something a week, I believe it was last week, talking about English class that I thought was very interesting, where you were saying how your teacher told you that you're too abstract and too universal when you don't think that you're abstract, right? It made me think of my beloved Mr. Robert Butler, who wrote From Where Dreams Come. And he made the point that very often when people write stories, like they are incredibly general and universal, thinking that they're particular, but they're not. So, for example, if I tell you, Don walked down the hallway to her mom's room. Okay, you got the information, right? Don walked down the hallway to her mom's room. But do you experience anything? And Mr. Butler comes along and says, smack, that's not what life is like. You don't walk down a hall to your mom's room. You hear the creaking of the floorboards under your feet as the temperature of the room gives you a chill, and then you turn the corner into your mom's room. And the interesting thing is that this, he makes this joke where he's like, yeah, you guys screwed up in wanting to do creative writing because you got to somehow be concrete using an abstract medium. Like language is fundamentally abstract and you got to make like concrete images in people's head. Y'all in trouble now. Like Butler's like, oh, y'all didn't know. So sorry. And it's so interesting because it's always an asymptote line, right? Like the word floor never equals the experience floor. But when you're writing a short story, you have to do everything in your power to make the description as close to the actual experience as you can. This, you mentioned that this had kind of philosophical significance. I completely agree, because if you take that seriously, the philosopher always has to be like, how do I approach the concrete? How do I get as close to that as possible? But what's so interesting too, kind of to what you were saying, um, floorboards cannot make the abstract floorboards cannot make the abstraction of floorboard, right? Only the human can create the abstraction of floorboard. That is the signifier referring to the experience. So in a funny way, it's precisely the fact that we are human beings, that we are able to generate abstractions or universals or generalities, of which then we have to fight against in order to get like a realistic description of the thing, of which is really difficult because language presents itself as being accurate. Like when you say Dawn walked, down the hall to her mom's room, you experience that as a sentence that successfully communicates its information. And it does, right? But problematically, it doesn't create the movie in your head. What Robert Butler talks a lot about is the movie in your head, right? Like you have to have that movie when you read the story going into your head. And when you write to the camera, as I like to call it, it's very different from just writing to convey information. So take these two sentences. Dawn walked into her mom's room after walking down the hall. Okay, you got the information, right? Now the second sentence. Dawn walked down the hall to her mom's room and then turned the corner. Both sentences are equal in information, but the first one is jagged because you're already at the mom's room and then you're told she walked down the hall, which is not how it works in reality. Where the second sentence, you go down the hall and then you're at mom's room, right? So the creative writer, the writer of a story, always wants to keep in mind the actual sequence of details. Otherwise, it becomes a jagged sentence. But, this is really hard if you're writing a story, precisely because the information is equally conveyed. So you don't even realize you're making a mistake unless you are trained to think in terms of the movement of the camera, the detail of experience, and fighting abstraction. So it's very interesting how when it comes to kind of language, especially if you're trying to convey a concrete experience, which when you're doing story, you always are, basically, that you actually have to think very differently, not just in terms of conveying the information, but having a successful movie playing in your head, a consistent stream of experience so that the reader is pulled in. And I do think, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, I do think that actually does have philosophical significance. And I do think it has intellectual significance because then one has to think about their philosophy following the camera, per se, following the concrete. And I meant to comment on that last time because I thought when you said that, Javier, was a really good point.
Add to what you're saying. What you're actually raising is a question of image in some senses, because what happens is that language can convey certain information, but it may not find its relationship with imagination immediately all the time. So we can in psychoanalysis we see that this problem happens both the ways. Sometimes you can have you can be having the imaginary there, but you can get split from the symbolic in that sense. So for instance, this question of ideal ego. Ideal ego is in that sense realm of imaginary in that, but when you start thinking about storytelling, there is something very unique about, and I don't personally understand it too well, to be honest. And in fact, I had read a paper on image long time back, and I have to go back and revisit it. I think it was by Ronseal, Future of the Image. But what essentially happens is that symbolic doesn't necessarily already include within itself a certain dimension of the imaginary necessarily, even when you have information coming to you. And on the flip side, imaginary doesn't necessarily automatically includes its relationship to symbolic. It needs to be built out. It needs to be worked through. And how that working takes place, and description and metaphors and all of these things are extremely important for that relationship to be formed in some senses.
Well, I'm just going to comment on that quickly. And then Thomas Jockin, it's a pleasure to see you. I know you've been moving. A lot has been going on. That's a good man right there. So Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir. It's interesting because when you write a story, part of the problem is since you experience the information as accurate, you think that a relation is conveyed in the information or image that's not actually there. And it's actually crazy when you go through like Butler's course and you go, oh my gosh, I'm like so abstract in my writing and I think I'm concrete. Oh my gosh, I'm imagining relations or like the images flowing together that actually aren't. And to me, that was a really powerful revelation and important. And then the other thing I wanted to tie. So if like humans are capable of creating abstractions, I think that's where ambiguity and the human element come together, Javier, to kind of tie to what you're saying. So we're able to create ambiguity. See, you really see this in like a human can create a story and they tend to gravitate toward ambiguity in the story without even realizing it. And you have to kind of fight that. And yet also it's because you can do that you can create something. So it creates an interesting dynamic.
I almost think like Heidegger got a little bit something right there when he talks about like started talking about poetry at the end. Because when we start looking at like poets and how they describe the world, um, it almost feels like they seem more concrete than we are. And that's why we can't even understand what they're saying. It's like, what is this guy actually seeing? Right? Because when I read like a poem, right, I'm going like, okay, he's just talking about a tree, right? It's just a tree, right? But in English, right, just saying it's just a tree, that's just an abstraction. There's no experience of the tree. That there is none of that in there. But what the poet is seeing, he is describing to you everything, every single little thing. Um, so yeah, I agree, Daniel. I think there's even when you're talking about, this, it seems like the very fact that we can have like this abstraction, right? And that when we have relations with things and people, we have very ambiguous things because it's so personal to us. So it almost makes me think like actually the very fact that when we begin with abstraction is because we already begin with some type of personal relation. But the problem is, in order to make it concrete, you have to really, really, really get detailed with that thing, and that's how you make it concrete. But it seems like abstraction is such a personal relation that it alienates everybody else from the whole thing. That in order to be concrete, you have to sort of really understand your relation to that thing. And then you make it a universal into which anybody else can make it understood, right? Like, okay, he is actually experiencing said this from a tree. Yeah, that's my thoughts from that.
Well, I'll add to that. What's so interesting is very often the creative writer will say be general and talk about humanity instead of Sarah, precisely because they think by discussing humanity, they're more universal. But the great irony is the exact opposite. When you actually talk about a particular Compson family, like in Faulkner, in a particular, it starts with a Y, county, then the universal is found in the particular. But you see, it's interesting because then it's so hard to get at the particular, precisely because we are beings of abstraction. That's how we understand things. So we require the very mechanism that makes it hard to get at things to get at things. So there's this way of thinking that has to combat the mechanism that makes it possible for you to understand, to say, see, not just look, kind of what we were saying last time. Yet, if you actually succeeded at overcoming your ability to abstract, you'd be an animal, right? You'd be like a Kafka panther or something, right? Like you wouldn't be intelligible. And that's the kind of paradoxical play that is very difficult to kind of get at in something that I find very interesting. So when we talk about, say, the apathetic subject, when we talk about this tendency of the human subject onto epistemology to consist of this kind of fighting itself to make itself possible, it's very interesting to trace that out and what are the implications of that. But with that, I'll give it to Chetan.
Yeah, give me 1 minute.
I waited till he moved from the camera. You see how I did that? I'm such a good guy.
I was just going to get a copy to write something. Yeah, I think it's an extremely fascinating point that you're making. And if you look at poetry and if you look at this question of art itself, and it's a question that I've been thinking about for my niche paper actually. That art has this very specific kind of a interesting problem that our art happens when we actually move away from reality. Art is a movement into as Freud recognized it. It is a movement away from reality principle into pleasure principle and affirming that journey for yourself in some senses. But interestingly, it is in that movement away that something like reality actually re-emerges for us. And if you look at, say, something like poetry, and I remember when I teach poetry, say in my classes, I normally use Terry Eagleton's very famous line in that sense that poetry is basically written with lines that doesn't need to end at the same point. That is what forms a poem at the heart of it. That if you want to write something, a poem doesn't have a fixed length of a line. You can write 3 words, 4 words, 5 words, and that constitutes a line in that sense in a poem. But in a verse, in the normal writing, you can't do that. So when you start thinking of poem in that manner, it's basically placing contiguous things together, things that can form patterns, but not necessarily related to any inner logic or any definite reason. That is why the meter and those kind of things become so important in poetry, because in poetry, you are actually placing two things together that do not need to be necessarily placed together. And that's the nature of art in some senses, that it emerges from this contiguity in that sense. It emerges from of this capacity to form relationships where none actually exist in that in its pure logical analytical demands in some senses. And when you start thinking about patterns that emerge from this kind of paradigmatic behavior, but this is paradigmatic in terms of, this is not a syntagmatic behavior. It's not like relationship that I share. Chetan went home. Relationship that Chetan shares with went. It is syntagmatic relationship. It's subject to verb, isn't it? And subject to predicate in that sense. But a relationship that this kind of relationship is more paradigmatic. What all things can Chetan be replaced with? What all nouns can Chetan be replaced with? And that is a paradigm in that sense. That is not constrained through any finite rules of a certain kind. That is constrained through a certain form of infinity, which needs to be worked through. And and how do we think through art in this precise way? I mean, I think poetry is at the heart of that kind of question, which we need to really think about.
I really like what you said there. In keeping that, in response to that, in also incorporating what Javier was saying about Heidegger, the later Heidegger is interesting in that he seems to think that language comes from poetry as opposed to poetry come from language, where poetry is actually fundamental, and it's more so that language is a transpositioning, I guess that's the term in music, when you take the symphony and you write it into notes. It's like a lessening of the music, and it's like this, I think it's transpositioning or transposing or something. So you have Beethoven's Ninth on sheet music, and then you have the Beethoven's Ninth performance. And the funny thing is they are the same, and yet they're not the same, right? One would not reduce Beethoven's Ninth to the sheet music, and yet it also seems erroneous to say that Beethoven's Ninth is not the sheet music. And that's sort of the weird doubleness. Like, what is the relation between the sheet music and the performance? And how do we figure that out? Well, it seems to have something to do inexplicably with the human element. There's something about the human element that makes it possible for there to be a relation between these things, because the human can pick up the instruments and play them, but the relation has to be participated in. Beethoven's Ninth, the music, doesn't just magically arise out of the sheet music, right? I mean, unless y'all know something I don't. It doesn't tend to arise out of the sheet music. So there has to be a human conditioning to be able to play the notes and a willingness to participate in it. So there's a certain vulnerability too, because you might make a mistake. And it's interesting to think how when humans create language, if indeed they have something inside of them that is already quote unquote poetic, when they speak non-poetically, they're shrinking it to the sheet music, as opposed to like building poetry out of language. That's kind of the difference that Heidegger seems very interested in. The later Heidegger. Now, connecting later Heidegger, early Heidegger, middle Heidegger, second grade Heidegger, and different things I'm not sure about, but my take on Heidegger's love of poetry, Holden, and some of his explorations of language are making that change. And there's also, arguably, if we follow Chesterton, kind of evidence that art is fundamental to the human experience, because what do we know all the cavemen like to do? They like to paint things. Everyone talks about the state of nature as, brute force or Rousseauian, but Chesterton's like, we do know they like to paint. They do like to create art. And so there's something very deep about art that what Heidegger wants to say is language, like non-artistic language, is transpositioned out of that, as opposed to art build out of non-artistic language. And that creates a very different ontological conception of what human beings are and how they communicate and why they communicate, as opposed to just thinking it's building up. Now, obviously, it's a bit of both. And the last thing before passing, and I'll say, what's interesting about poetry as well is when one speaks just normally, like I say, laptop, it's like I'm trying to get directly at the laptop, just say laptop. And the funny thing is, since I can never capture the phenomenon of laptop in the word, I actually don't get at it. But it seems like I do, right? Because I speak about it directly. The funny thing is poetry in a way gets at things like sideways. like they approach them, acknowledging they can never get it. And they're trying to approach them in a human way. Because when I experienced the laptop, I also experienced the laptop I got at Best Buy, the laptop that my kid hid from me one day. There's an emotional connection. There's a color connection. There's all these different things. It's not just the information of laptop. And poetry is trying to approach that, but precisely because it knows it can never directly capture that, it's always like an acetope line. And the funny thing is that an acetope line is actually more concrete in a sense. It's more like reality actually is than direct approaches. But since we are so trained to think of direct approaching as concrete, then we tend to accuse poetry of being abstract, when actually it is arguably kind of more honest because it's like what you experience is this full sum of phenomenological things, emotions, colors, experience, information, and you never fully capture it. And so it's funny how we then label, and I think if I were to say there seems to be, Heidegger kind of understood that. And I think there are like Hans Balthasar, there are some different theologians and different people that also talk on that. That's an interesting topic. And then the question is, what is the relation that humans have and how they've come in to make the relation between those things? Go right ahead, Javier.
Okay. I think I'm going to talk about some of the things I've been reading on Nishida because I think it's kind of important. This will be directly in relation to what we're talking about, I think. So it's still a fresh concept to me, so don't take my word as gold here.
Blood oath. Everything that comes out of his mouth is a blood oath.
So you talked about the relation between the human, and we talked about sheet music and then into music, right? Nishida has this idea of the logic of place, where it seems like in order for us to have a relation to something, or actually to know the relation in itself, there has to be sort of like a container, basically. And he kind of borrows from Plato's Timaeus, the notion of place. But he's very adamant to say that his notion of place is not like Plato's notions of place. So he brings up this thing where he says that when we talk about being and nothing, that nothingness is not a true nothingness because it's always an oppositional nothingness. So in order to have these opposites, he's saying that there has to be a holding of these opposites in order that when it becomes whole, it has to be able to reflect itself on the place as the place reflects back. So that means you actually know what that wholeness is, right? So he's basically kind of saying, like, even though Hegel says, right, pure nothingness, pure being, right? The oscillation between the two is becoming, right? But what Nishida is saying is, how do you know that that is becoming unless you have a container to which that becoming reflects itself against the place to which you can understand that that is becoming, basically. So this is what he's calling absolute nothingness. And he's almost basically saying that actually Hegel only gets at oppositional nothingness, not absolute nothingness, because absolute nothingness is the container. The same thing with thought thinking itself. In order for thought to think itself, it has to be in a place to think itself. So he's very adamant about locating. In order for you to locate, how can you determine what the relationship is? You have to understand the location before we can say this relationship and whatever this relation is. Okay, so that's what Nishida, this is what I understand so far from Nishida, okay? This is like, I'm like still trying to grapple like the implications of this. But anyways, yeah, I think, we're talking about poetry, right? I think Nishida would say, like, obviously poetry still has like a place that it's sort of contained in. But yeah, I've been wanting to think more about that relation.
Javier, can I disturb you for a minute? Just 1 second. I want a clarification. When you talk about a container, you're talking about a form in that sense. A form which is. Would you connect with that, or how are you thinking about that container in that sense?
I guess the way Nishida is trying to describe it is almost like a mirror, but it's like a place that, like the whole place is the mirror, basically. Because he's saying, like, if a subject and object unite, how do you know that they united? Right? So he's saying, like, in order for you to know that they united, there needs to be a place, but that place needs to have like some type of mirror-like ability for you to know that that's what happened, basically. So this is all I understand so far as place. I don't know if it's like a form. He's basically saying, like, I think the more psychological way of explaining like his place is this notion of field of consciousness. Everything is always caught in the field of consciousness itself. Is it a form? I don't know. I think he would say, like, if you're talking about uniting form and like content, he would still say like that needs a place too. So it's like an ever expanding like place that which he calls like absolute nothingness. um, like even physical space is still caught in the deeper place of what Nishida is talking about. So I'm still like, but again, I just started reading this stuff, so but these are good questions. I'll try to,
I was saying something else also. Please go ahead. You talk about poetry also. I'm sorry I stopped you there. Yeah.
Oh no, you're good. I mean, that was really just the main crux of it. I was just trying to bring up the, Nishida's logic of place, like in relation to thinking about the subject, the sheet of music, into music, like all these relations sort of, if we were to use like Nishida's place, for example, it seems like that in order to understand the relations itself, you need a container for it, basically. I don't like saying container because I don't think Nishida would agree with my use of language of container, but I think that's like the best way I understand it, as a sort of like container, right? So as much as like Luber talks about story, right? The thing that I haven't heard him talk about, you can correct me, Daniel, is actually the actual place within the story and the place where the story takes place as well. So there's like two places, right? There's a place in the story, and then there's a place where the story takes place.
I think Ms. Lubo would say, so he's got story and theme are kind of the dialectical tension where every story, there's the way of writing a story where you impose the theme, which is problematic. And then you have the type of where you write the story with the theme, or where the theme arises and it's more organic and it's sort of living out. So that's kind of a difference between, say, a philosophical practice of top down or opposed to sort of emerging in the very practice of it. And he would say story. We had a conversation on kind of how a lot of, a good way to describe what some philosophers are doing is creating a clearing, which would be a kind of setting where people can mutually occupy and operate according to similar frameworks so that they can be intelligible to one another and understand. So, for example, Kant's categorical imperative is not merely, say, make a list of laws that you follow, but it's like, oh, you believe in the categorical imperative? I believe in the categorical imperative? Oh, we can exist in a space together. So, we have a similar kind of realm by which to understand. So to think about philosophers in the business of a kind of clearing making, a kind of setting making, as opposed to a system is something, and he ascribes that to Heidegger. And I think that's a useful framing in many different ways. I think the holding now, maybe I'm incorrect with this. Hegel will talk about kind of resolve at the beginning of the Science of Logic, or kind of the resolute and the sort of resolve to hold through the paradoxical tensions, or using a category until you get to the point where it fails, and then moving on to the next category and keep going and keep going and keep going. And there's a way in which that's a kind of holding that you're doing, but it's found in a certain disposition or orientation that the individual has, because they are the principle of which relates the failed categories in themselves by sort of carrying on from one to the next, and then what are the onto-epistemological consequences of that. So there's a way in which the kind of holding and the sort of being resolute can go together in different ways. Also, it's interesting when you talk about absolute none, because there is a way. So one of the things I think that has made some thinking difficult, especially in the apophatic traditions, is the word nothing is used to mean like this incredibly pregnant being that you cannot comprehend, therefore you experience as nothing. And so nothingness has a phenomenological signification to what it is like for human beings to experience God. But obviously, for example, with a Master Eckhart or whatever, but God obviously to himself is not apophatic, right? So likewise, I always took Nishida when he's talking about like an absolute nothingness to be talking about it's always relative to the complete fullness of being, that to understand you have to reduce into a category that can never be equal to it. And yet nonetheless, you have to operating according to that category, because if you do not, you'd almost have like there's almost like a bad nothingness or a kind of intelligibility nothingness where nothing connects, and then an apophatic nothingness of that is full, that has the fullness of being, if you will, or all whatever, you know, how one takes that, the fullness of phenomenon. Or if we want to take up Marion again, the supersaturated phenomenon is how he describes God, actually, as a supersaturated phenomenon. So the God without being ends up a supersaturated phenomenon. And I always took the notion of absolute nothing to be a kind of supersaturated phenomenon. And he doesn't, I also took it, he doesn't want to use the category of being, because in the same way that Marion would say, the moment you introduce being, you're bringing a certain meaning of what being is to you, and therefore framing God in a manner that reduces him. Therefore, he wants us to think of God as a supersaturated phenomenon, ergo a person, ergo love, ergo an entity that you can only know in the encounter. Likewise, the absolute nothingness seems to have a lot to do with a similar notion applying to everything, basically, to life itself. But since you cannot fully comprehend a supersaturated phenomenon, one has to use categories, use ways of knowing, and then hold themselves in that tension of knowing they're inevitably going to fail, and be resolute in that, so that they can make sense of anything, but also not become overly competent in their notions of how things are and different things like that. Which, you know, again, I kind of see connecting with some of the being, you know, what we're talking about in regard to Hegel. So that would be a way I've understood it, whether that's accurate or not.
You know, one of the difficult things about Nishida is that he's using a dialectic like Hegel, right? He's using the same method, basically. But he's so adamant about being different from Hegel that, I mean, I don't know. Like, I've shared a couple papers with Michelle, and we've been reading like some, you know, work on between Nishida and Hegel. And I mean, it seems like Nishida's main critique of Hegel is like Hegel is still stuck in what he calls like the grammatical subject, which he takes from Aristotle, where the subject cannot become predicate. And for Nishida, that seems to be a big issue. And so I either, you know, again, like several interpretations of this is like, oh, this is just strictly like the difference between Nishida and Hegel is like strictly language based, right? But I mean, I don't know. Like, I read a paper recently where a woman, Dr. Schultz, she compared Nishida's dialectic with Hegel's dialectic, and she says they both fail at getting the concrete. But actually, if we use both of their dialectics, we can get closer to the concrete. But I felt like in some ways, like, yeah, but doesn't the concrete always need to fail anyways? Like, that's the reason why we always like striving for the concrete. Like, it always needs to fail. Like, what's the point? Like, I cannot say like, yes, I'm concrete. Like, that's it, it's over. You know, like, if you think of like actually writing a story, you in every sentence you have to be concrete. Try to be concrete in every sentence.
Yeah. I not to interject, but I like the dialectic of dialectics. That's nice there, Javier. I always, for me, part of the genius of Hegel is making failure part of the system. Like, that actually is like, there's a kind of failure that, and when we say a failure, the failure becomes the mechanism of advancement, although advancement is questionable, because ultimately at the end of the phenomenology of spirit, you're realizing what always already was the case. But there's a way in which you come to realize that there's a certain point where self-consciousness cannot go on. It has to make, you know, like what I like to say, the absolute choice into reason, and so on and so on. So I always took failure to be kind of part of the process that's then sublimated. But again, I'm not an expert in Professor Schultz's thinking, so I don't want you to get an F- on your test. So
No, I think they have a misunderstanding of like absolutes, because they wrote in the paper that Hegel and Nishida both fail because they have like some static absolute. But I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. But I guess they're trying to point out the fact that if you're having a dialectic, you're pointing at something that's unchanging, right? If there's a constant dialectic going on, you're pointing at something unchanging. So therefore, you have some type of static within that unchanging. But I mean, I don't know, like that. But I did like the notion of like the dialectic of the dialectic, and actually, a recent philosopher, more modern Japanese philosopher, he said that's actually how you negate dialectics. You have to use the dialectic against itself, and so you get something like a dialectic. but I mean, for me, I'm like, I don't know where to go at this point. Like, we're at a dialectic now, but isn't that what the realization of Hegel was, right? Like, oh, right, we already were. We already are.
Well, I'll give it to Dimitri. Where you go is you sit on your couch and you pet your cat and maybe watch Rick and Morty. That I think would probably get you pretty far, Javier. I think it's important to realize that the word dialectic is stable, but not the dialectic itself. Like the word dialectic is stable, but not the action of engaging in dialectic. And that's kind of, and you could say that the dialectic is constant, as in it's regularly employed, but constant and stable, I think, are not the same, perhaps. But with that, I'll give it to Dimitri. Dimitri, it's beautiful to see you, my good man. Again, you have the coolest background with the shelf with the books on it. I still have this really weird photograph hanging. I need to do something about that. So well done, sir.
Javier, here. I really liked what you brought, and especially that you brought up yourself this daunting task of like working with Hegel and Nishida, like seeing how that goes. I mean, there's so much happening here. Let me first read this Hegel quote to ground us in the concrete. Thus, for instance, being is a pure determination of thought, and yet it never occurs to us to make the is the object of our consideration. We typically believe that the absolute must lie somewhere far yonder, but it is precisely that which is wholly present and which we as thinking beings always carry with us and make use of, even if without explicit consciousness of this fact. So that's such a simple point that I really like affirming. The fact that when we're talking about being, you know, what the hell are we talking about? It's just a different conjugation of the word is. That's all it is. And that's, I think, good to take into account when we're thinking about this. Now, insofar as the dialectic of the dialectic and the non-dialectic, this is just someone needs to write a funny paper on this because it's very funny. But Hegel wasn't a dialectical thinker. If you I think this would be the only critique not the only critique, but Cadell wrote a paper years ago about a speculative or a note for dialectical thinkers. But Hegel wasn't a dialectical thinker. Like Hegel says explicitly, I'm a speculative thinker. So what's the difference between dialectical reason and speculative reason? Well, the way I've been thinking about it, and please don't take my words as a kind of absolute for it, is that, although I think Hegel would somewhat agree with it, is that dialectical reason basically brings you to the self-related negativity between phenomena, to the fact that there's always a subject involved in a certain singular way that's also universal. Now, it would be right to say that, okay, but what now? You know, okay, we come to the negativity all the time, what the hell? Well, here's where speculative comes in. And speculative is actually a scientific synonym Hegel comes up with, which is an interchangeable word with mysticism. Hegel is actually a mystic, but he's a scientific mystic. And that's what he calls speculative. He says this explicitly in the Encyclopedic Logic. And speculative reason is where you actually, the way I would say it, you affirm the contradiction, and you resolve it by making it concrete. That's the way I think of it. So this is not, Hegel's not just, it's not just a spiral into the self-related negativity. Well, I'll bring out another Hegel quote here that is relevant for this idea of absolute nothingness. So he says, by anguish is expressed that which we know as the absolute negativity. That is the self-conscious, self-experienced, the self-relating negativity, which is therefore absolute affirmation. Wait a second. Now we have the reversal of absolute negativity into some kind of absolute affirmation. So how does this work? Well, Freud, Lacan, and Zizek agree on this one thing, and that's that anxiety is the affect which doesn't lie. It's the only affect which doesn't lie. And now there's this theory about anxiety versus fear, right? Fear is when I have an object that I fear. So like, hey, what are you scared about? What are you fearing? Ah, this spider, whatever, this caterpillar. And then they say, yeah, but anxiety doesn't have an object. Lacan says, no, that's not how it works. Anxiety actually does have an object. And the object of anxiety is actually way too close. It's so fucking pervasive that you cannot pin it down as an object. Let's say it in this way. So anxiety is actually a very climactic point of jouissance, of enjoyment. And therefore, I think I can, you can connect this to the reversal of absolute negativity, of the there's no object in anxiety, to absolute affirmation of the intensity of jouissance, of enjoyment.
Beautifully put, Dimitri. And I perhaps some of the emphasis on essential negativity is where you're staying in the realm of the dialectical reasoning, which I think, now I would say this, it does seem that dialectical reasoning seems to be the primary attribute of the phenomenology of spirit. Then as you move into the science of logic, it becomes more of the speculative reasoning, I would say. Now, and then it's almost like you have to go through dialectical reasoning to get to the place where you can engage in speculative reasoning. And then, of course, what's interesting to me, though, is then the question of what is the difference between, say, the dialectical onto-epistemology that one can think about and, say, a speculative onto-epistemology that is being presented, say, in the science of logic. And it's interesting to trace those different things out. But it would seem that training in dialectical reasoning and being a dialectical thinker is basically the precondition that is necessary in order to begin engaging in speculative reasoning. But then the question becomes, like, because I'm always really interested, and I don't have a finished paper on it. I started one and it got very long and then I was sad, on why are there so many debates between Hegelian scholars. Like, you have a lot of people that are going to emphasize the theological possibilities of Hegel, how Hegel's pointing to a possible theological presentation. Then you have someone like Zizek that's going to be emphasizing essential negativity. Then I think you also get the debate where if you read Hegel through the philosophy of right, you get a different take than if you do it through the phenomenology of spirit, and you get all these different things. But it does seem as if the distinction between the dialectical reasoning and the speculative reasoning, if I use those phrases, seems to be part of the mystery, part of the secret on why you have all these different interpretations of Hegel. But I have to write that paper, and it's kind of an active thought. And I'm also interested, I guess what's interesting to me is, like, when I take, as you know, in my paper where I talk about the spirit as a bone, and I basically think about that as literally the spirit is bone. Like, it is that thing. There's a way, and I think about that like with the Eucharist, right? I talk about, like, there's a transubstantiational ontology to things, where at their very heart is a kind of paradox that is not a paradox to itself, though, because it is that thing. Does the word, so this is what's interesting to me that I'm not sure about and I think about a lot. Does the word dialectic capture transubstantiation? Is the word dialectic a successful way to talk about a transubstantial ontology, which I associate with the kind of the speculative reasoning that Hegel's getting at? Or is something missing from dialectic, the term dialectic, that isn't quite captured in transubstantiation? I do not know. That is an incomplete thought, but it's something I think about quite a bit. So that's something I think about. And that category of reasoning and that category of distinction might be useful for thinking about the way, based on a lot of these net discussions, how the apophatic subject carries themselves in the world, how an individual, deals with this tree of knowledge that you cannot eat from. And Chitan, by transubstantiation in Christianity, there's the notion of the Eucharist, which is the body of Christ. The priest will hold up a piece of bread, and in Catholic thought, they literally believe that is the body of Christ. That it's not a symbol. It is the body of Christ. That there is literally a mystical transubstantiation in the phenomenon of the bread that makes it the body of Christ. You can, a lot of people say that's weird, and a lot of the big debate between Protestants and Catholics is they're like, no, it's a symbol. It is not literally the body of Christ. But for Catholics, it's actually a huge deal that the Eucharist is in fact the body of Christ, because that's the literal presence of the divine, not just a symbol of the divine. So that's actually a big debate. So that's what the word transubstantiation means. Javier.
I think it was Chitan that actually brought my insight on, like, when we talk about, like, literal, because like the way you said it, Chitan, I remember you were like, you're like, yeah, but even like the notion of literal is like, basically like everything is literal, like the way you had explained to me, like everything is literal, because I mean, that's what always fascinates me, the debates between like, this the literal body of Christ and so on. That when people talk about symbolic, it's like, okay, but there is something that is, how are we defining literal in this sense? Because it's like, even if I were to take like a very scientific approach to the literalness of the body of Christ and so on, um, if we're talking about, for me, it would just be like, oh, it's just a rearrangement of atoms and energy. And therefore, you're always in the presence of, the literal body of Christ and so on, right? So, but to go with what Daniel was talking about, yeah, Daniel, if you could give me a little bit, like, I really want to start grasping what you're talking about when you're talking about speculative reasoning and dialectical reasoning. Like, if you could give me like some examples of like how you distinguish the two, and then on top of that, I do really like all the Hegelians arguing, because I think this is perfect, right? I think actually the best way to use Hegel is to actually manifest it in your own way, the way Nishida does it, because I think that enriches actually everything that we're talking about. Because now you have Nishida's dialectic, which is so enriching, because it's almost like Buddhism has its own dialectic now. Buddhism does have its response. But I think if everybody did this would actually create a very interesting discourse and relation between so many dialectics to have relations to. Literally dialectic of the dialectic, right? Like you could just have so many. Which I think would be beautiful in my opinion. So I encourage that to happen. I'm curious what Nietzschean dialectic would look like, in a very obscure way. But yeah, Daniel, if you could give me examples on speculative reasoning and dialectical reasoning, I'm just a little confused on that. I want to know like what that look like. I think I kind of got it from. I'm assuming transubstantiation would be kind of similar to like speculative reasoning. But I'm gonna let you talk.
Well, first, I think a Nietzschean dialectic and all that would be great. I think we have that with the conference coming up, right? It's going to be wonderful with Cadell and everyone. Emilio, great to see you. Then I'll pass it to Dimitri and Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, always good to see you. Generally speaking, now again, this is what's interesting to me. Like, what is the difference? Because transubstantiate, that's a metaphor. That's not what Hegel himself used. But I think thinking of ontology as having this doubleness, this kind of paradox at its very depth, in its very isness, is what transubstantiation is trying to get at. And speculative reasoning, as I would take, would be getting at that raw isness. Whereas dialectical reasoning would be going, you would see the destabilizing, you would examine a subject, you would see the inevitable destabilizing element in it, which would make you consider the other side. Then you would see the destabilizing element in that, and it'd be kind of a push forward. But eventually, you kind of get to the place where you can't really push beyond absolute knowing, right? You kind of get to that. And so the question is, okay, well, if absolute knowing, there's some sort of insight into the possibility of ontology being transubstantial or having a transubstantiation that's going into it. What does it mean to think that? Like, how does it look like to think that? And that's where I do agree with Mr. Ebert's paper on the sublimation of mathematics, where the ontoepistemology of Hegel is not merely a being, not merely a becoming. But Hegel himself notes this, where it's a kind of being and becoming, where there is he'll use the mathematics to talk about the waves, it will be compressing in different things. And to me, thinking that is more tuned to speculative reasoning. But I have to write that paper, and those would be some of the initial things I would say. But I will give it to Dimitri and Mr. Jockin. And again, it's always great to have you find people here.
Like I already kind of hinted at, dialectical reasoning, it's like a method of thinking that you can apply to concepts, so you can extract or distill the self-related negativity of the subject. So let's say you want to think about cause and effect. Well, there's a subject here connecting and dividing them. This is why you need dialectical reasoning. Like, this is what Hegel's doing. But speculative, but if you just get to that self-related negativity and you do it on and on and on and on with all kinds of concepts, you just end at the empty subjectivity of absolute knowing. Now, I would say Nietzsche is a speculative thinker, actually. Nietzsche goes down back into the world with absolute knowing, and is playing with phenomena, is playing with concepts in this very super intimate way, affirming contradiction in a very unique ways. So Cadell last has a quote that I will read for you. What is most real for spirit in this process of sublation according to Hegel, is left of nature after logic has sublated it. Once you have sublimated a natural object, you can let it go. But if an object resists your sublation, then logic remains fixed to it, attached to it. Thus, true spiritual maturity is not holding abstract knowledge of nature, but releasing it. I'm just going to read another quote by Hegel to connect. By pushing these ends to their ultimate limit, by knowing and willing only themselves in their particularity to the exclusion of the universal, human beings are evil. And this evilness is their subjectivity. Very bombastic. One way that I've been trying to read this, and I still have to learn a lot, obviously, is that what seems to be happening here is that, well, what is we have the triad of nature, logic, and spirit, right? And if we take Alexander Barth's idea of what is masculinity, he says it's the split between pathos and logos. So spirit is, of course, the mythos. It's kind of the unification of those, where logic kind of takes it up into the singular and universal, which are actually simultaneous. So, like Cadell says in his last video on Hegel, what the speculative thinker does, of like the real philosopher of absolute knowing, is turning contingency into necessity, which is very painful, actually, because then it's kind of this amor fati thing, you know, like I have willed it, the past, like this, where you could have been totally powerless. But if you go the other way and particularize to your own supposed uniqueness, that would be developing narcissism, actually. I think the difference here is that, you know, in, like Cadell says, in like to become spiritually mature, it's not to hold on to some abstract knowledge of nature, but it is to raise it up into a singular and universal concreteness, which is a process of loss. You know, you have to lose all the time by doing this. So this was just a spontaneous thought I had today, that maybe you could read Hegel, you know, inclusive of the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic, as a like the thinker against narcissism, because narcissism is that which holds on to the particularity no matter what. Whereas Hegel has, you know, he talks about this sacrifice, and also at the end of the chapter on absolute knowing, he has these very bombastic, interesting things to say. That's I guess that's my own way of reading Hegel, to allude to what you said, Javier. You know, like how do we sublate Hegel in our own personal sense?
Hi, everyone. I'm sick. That's why I'm not in class right now. I usually teach on Thursdays, so that's why I'm relatively quiet. But yeah, I just want to just add some notes, just because I miss this group. I'm glad even though I'm sick, I'm glad to take advantage of being able to listen in on everyone's conversation. So I heard a lot. I heard some Aristotle got dropped in there by Javier, so I felt compelled to get in there. Actually, by the way, so I jumped in a little late, but in conversation originally about abstractions and ways of understanding and relating to the concrete, you know, I instantly wrote in my notes, specifically with poetry. Remember, poetry was meant to talk about the exemplars as the way of understanding reality, is by understanding the exemplars, which are icons of excellence, right? Or some distinction about them that are beyond the mortal men, for example. I just want to reference, we actually still use abstractions, but just a different mode of it. We use averages now, literally the average man, and we think that's the positive reality, that in our cognition, in our ways of thinking of epistemology, we use the average to try to understand or map on reality. So I just want to point out the tensions of what poetry is meant to talk about, compared to contemporary ways of thinking, epistemology-wise, is the shift of the exemplar to the average, I to say, or the icon to the average. By the way, another note from Aristotle, why poetry is so important. He made a comment about the genius of the poet is his power of resemblance, which, remember with Friedhan's commentary about this kind of uncovering of principles that are more than just rule bound. They almost are geniuses actually are the rule, and they actually self-generate, kind of redound out. of principles that kind of go beyond the rules. So I think of any expert or any genius in a craft, they literally become an exemplar icon in that craft. So for example, like in my talk I gave about boxing as a grammar literacy. So when I say Mike Tyson, when I say Muhammad Ali, when I say Floyd Mayweather, those draw images in your mind, literally modes of being that other boxers, when I say that term, we know exactly what that means. And that's interesting. That's almost a mode of when Javier wrote, and he's actually absolutely correct. Aristotle is very clear that primary substance cannot be predicated of itself, which is also very interesting. Icons seem to be the one the one difference, or the one challenge of that claim. But it also brings up another tension point. Any kind of, like for example, beauty or truth or good, the self-predication of those terms are a huge contention in Platonic thought. So Aristotle just dismisses by saying it's a third-man argument in general, that's my interpretation, but it does draw out also just another point. Isn't it interesting when I say, Daniel is Daniel or Javier is Javier, it actually almost has a tautology of no meaning. It's actually nothing being said. It does seem to verify Aristotle's claim that primary substance cannot be predicated of itself, but icons seem to have that power, that we can't say Mike Tyson is Mike Tyson, and we have a qualification of what that means. There's an image that gets demonstrated from that. Now, that could be I think that could be defeated pretty easily too, but I just want to draw out the tensions are going on there. There's one last note. Let's see. See my notes on what was said. That's another thing too, by the way. It's also the difference between a word and a name, right? Words, Aristotle comments, it's capturing a mental experience by a word. And a name is a positing for indication. So actually it's almost a little what we're talking about, things that try to get at things directly versus a kind of indirect referencing. Names is accepted to be a kind of indirect reference. That doesn't seem to capture the whole totality. That's why a proper noun name that does that. It seems like we need something more to capture understanding from just a name by itself. Words are meant to, in theory anyway, the argument is made it captures mental experience that can be understood from multiple people who use the same word if they're using it univocally versus equivocally. Lastly, by the way, just on the transubstantiation, I apologize, everyone, thank you for your patience. I've been writing notes this whole time. I want to be very, they give fairness to the Catholics for their argument transubstantiation. It's really, I was about to write a note on the chat about it, right? It's a distinction of spirit to form. That's basically what's going on here, that the appearance of the bread is the appearance of bread, even to its form, literally the composition of form and matter together, but it's its spirit. It's basically been superimposed into reality. Now, I actually don't think that's that absurd. Let me give you an example. When we say, like any mode of a proper analogy, a proportionate analogy operates in the same way. Because if you took it at a literal point, it would seem absolutely absurd, but yet the statement actually captures a real reality that we think is true. When I say real reality, it means that we have powers of prediction that come from this fact. For example, when I say liquid capital, is capital actually liquid? No, it's not. But the fact that everyone understands what that means, not just some random association, but the fact that we can use liquid dynamics in physics to understand capital flows, it means using that analogical framing of liquid and flow to capital that came originally from water, study of water dynamics, Brownian movements, actually points to a super reality that connects water liquid dynamics to finance and capital and markets. These things have absolutely nothing to do with each other from a forms matter correspondence, but it's kind of that super relationship of what I think Cartesian summarizes from Aquinas. It's the super form, basically, which is what spirit would be. But notice that's my point, is that literally it makes absolutely no sense to say capital is liquid, but yet from an analogical spirit metaphor framing of it, it actually, not only is it connected, it actually is real because you can make predictive powers with it. So it meets our requirements of reality in an epistemology point of view. Okay, so that's all I got right now. I'm not a Heidegger scholar, so I can't comment on the Heidegger stuff. Sorry, guys. But when I talk about Aristotle, that's my wheelhouse. That's all for me.
Well, Thomas Jockin, I appreciate you being here, even though you are sick. My goodness. And the value of the college went down because you are not there today to teach your class. So thank you for being here. I will just note and then give it to Javier. I think it's actually very important that the phrase spirit is a bone is actually the being of spirit is a bone, the entire phrase. And I think the being part is very important because it suggests the form, like you're saying in transubstantiation. So he's not saying that the becoming of spirit is a bone, as in spirit to spirit. He's saying the being of spirit is a bone. And I think that's where you start to see sort of the transubstantiation overlay. And I agree. I don't think it's absurd or anything. But let me give it to Javier right there. And again, Mr. Jockin, always a pleasure. And your expertise in Aristotle is always inspiring, by the way. So it's beautiful.
So wonderful. I actually like that Thomas brought up the icons as like almost this breaking of the rule between subject and predicate, right? It actually, so the way Dimitri was describing speculative reasoning, it made me think of Christ's kenosis, kind of like the self-emptying of such. It almost seems like the notion of return is actually the initiation into speculative reasoning. Because, you know, I think Dimitri was saying like actually to stay in the dialectical reasoning would be inevitably to meet an effacement. So you can't be stuck in that sort of cycle. So you have to make some return by letting go, returning. That this is how I understand speculative reasoning to be. So it almost seems like Jesus coming down, becoming man, so on, is like the actual engagement of speculative reasoning, like this initiation into kenosis. Which is interesting. Because it's almost like actually in order to forgive all sins, and this is just playing off the Christian language, to forgive all sins is like you actually have to become a self-emptying receptacle in order to reach everybody. Because I think it was Trey that actually talks about sin as a negativity. So in order for Christ to forgive all sins, you have to actually be a negativity in order to negate that negativity in the affirmation of forgiving all sins. Which I include that as like the formula, right? Negative. So I find that really fascinating when we talk about the significance of like theology in this sense of Christ. But it actually also makes me think of Nishida's problem with Hegel about the subject cannot become predicate, because it makes me bring up the problem of grace. And even the Christian notions of like Holy Spirit, right? For example, if we actually take the Christian theology seriously, the notion of spirit coming into a human subject and then the subject sort of being the puppet of that Holy Spirit, I think that is actually an example of where the subject becomes predicate and the predicate becomes subject. When people talk about like, oh, the Holy Spirit was working through me, so and so. But you see a lot of these debates going on, like, is it you that's actually doing it, or like, someone. So I mean, I don't know. I'm curious about how you guys feel about that sort of proposition, where it almost seems like grace, the problem of grace is actually the problem of where subject becomes predicate and predicate becomes subject, in a way. But it also seems to be the engagement of speculative reasoning as well.
Yeah, I have some thoughts about this, and it relates to art as well. Oh yeah, one point I forgot to say is that for Hegel also poetry is the most concrete form of art. And I would like to say here also that Hegel's not against harmony, In the encyclopedic logic, he actually says harmony is concrete unity. Because if you have, let's say, one note, there's no contradiction. But if you have many notes and actually a piece of music, then you have contradictions and a concrete harmony going on there. So what is art? What's the reason of art? For Hegel, the three forms of absolute spirit are religion, art, and philosophy. Now, I find this super interesting. I don't want to say too much because well, basically, philosophy is special because it can actually comprehend, cognize, and think the absolute. But religion and art can also do things that philosophy cannot do. So I don't think it's right to reduce, what Hegel doesn't do is reduce art to mere representation or mere picture thought or like abstract form, something like this. For Hegel, it's actually the idea. It's the unity of concept and truth, and it's actually actual insofar as the appearance of the truth of art is the same as the truth of art in that moment of freedom. So I think this is also where like the term infinity becomes relevant, because in a piece of art there's maybe even like Javier, what you said, like this this collapse of subject and predicate into the work of art, for example, into the dance, you know, or like the piece of music, because the piece of music is always already as it should be, you know, that's what it is. You can critique it for that, you know, maybe it's not your taste, that's fine. So yeah, there is for Hegel, there's a reason to art itself in relation to the fact that it shows us the reality of the absolute in a concrete manner, and it's in an actual manner. This is why I love the term actuality, by the way, because there's a coincidence of appearance and essence as appearance immediately.
No, I think that's very good. And for me, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jonkin. In the work that Michelle and I like to do at OG Bros, we make this distinction between true and rational, where we will say that the true isn't the rational, meaning that what we believe is true organizes what we believe is rational. So if you think it's going to rain today, it's true, it's then rational to bring an umbrella, right? But what's interesting is if the true isn't the rational, then how do you determine what is true except within the rational, of which doesn't equal the true, right? Like you think it's going to rain today does not equal raining today, right? And then what I just said is of itself an idea, not the experience of the true. So in our work, there's kind of two dialectics, if you will. So it's kind of funny you brought that up. There's the dialectic where you realize that within rationality, the more it's very Hegelian. Once you think about a thing, you get to the point where there's a destabilizing element, and then you think it through dialectically. But then there's kind of the other dialectic is thinking and perceiving. Like me perceiving the laptop right now is just the pure phenomenon of the laptop. If I would like close my brain and just experience the laptop, really hard to do. And there's the dialectic between the perception of the laptop and the thought of the laptop, of which then I am always hopefully reinforming. But then within the thought of the laptop, there's a dialectic as well between new information that comes in, ways I experiences that are constantly destabilizing. For me, a way I guess I would put this difference between dialectical thinking and speculative reasoning is that I associate dialectical reasoning with what I call rationality, and speculative reasoning with what I call truth. And of course, this is a problem, because getting at you have to speculate. You have to speculatively reason from a place of the dialectical reasoning, which isn't the speculative reasoning, which creates all sorts of fun games, right? Like I have to determine what I believe is true relative to a rationality that isn't that true. So this creates all sorts of interesting sort of paradoxical tensions that have to be worked through. And what does that look like? Because, and that is one of the ways I think about, just as a note before giving it on to Mr. Jonkin, and then I'll give it to Chitan. And the other thing I would say is I associate truth with art, and I associate philosophy with rationality. But then there's a philosophy that is aware of the role of art that seems to be a different kind of philosophy that I call AB philosophy versus AA philosophy. All of these terminologies I'm just adding to the great Brunswick stew of our conversation. But those, I think, are ways I think about this. Like, I think generally people determine what they believe is true by artistic, emotional experiences. And they determine what is rational according to what they think relative to those experiences of truth. And this is where I think Hegel's doing something similar. I would have to go through that. It's obviously not exactly the same, but that is one way. That's kind of all of that is kind of the stuff I'm getting at whenever we talk about the true isn't the rational. And then it just turns out Hegel already thought about all that, of course, and one just lives in that. So, you know, but that's one way to frame it. I associate coming to one's truth with art, emotion, and different things like that. So, and then, of course, you have this other layer of considering the truth of rationality and the rational truth. And that's where you start mixing it on this higher paradoxical level and looking at it. And that's all fun. And I'll be quiet now. So Mr. Jockin and Chitan.
Yeah, just to build on, Javier's asking the question about grace. Well, two parts. One was, it's funny because it's a term that got co-opted by business, synergy. Originally synergy meant cooperation with the Holy Spirit. So the idea is that our power of rationality is our power of choice, in the sense that we can choose to cooperate with the Holy Spirit and participate with it versus choosing not to. So that's a term that, and by the way, and from an Islamic point of view, it's not that far off from our point of view, in the sense that the holy names of God. So human beings can participate in the holy names of God, but incompletely, right? And then based on our degree of holiness, we get closer to that meaning, to the source. So I could be patient, I could have courage, I could be the gatherer. Those things could be predicated of humans, of Muslims, but those are always lacking, right? So this is very much on a philosophy of lack, an idea. There's a kind of basically the who is the subject predicate unity combined, it's God, because basically God's in all this diversity of expressions gets unified into one form. So it actually, I've been meditating on this point in the philosophy of lack. It actually, I kind of believe this point. I'll leave with this. Just kind of meditating on our work together on it. It does not only have an justification to a theological God, right, in the sense of like grounding of all existence in one, but not just that, not just any God, but a kind of uniform God, a one God, right, in the sense that all this diversity of lacks have to get unified by one perfection. It's not just each perfection is isolated by itself. It has to get unified into one. Anyways, that's just more about a Sandra note. Just want to share that point.
Reflect upon, this discussion we're having between dialectics and speculative thinking. I may be saying whatever, in some, whatever I'm saying may be unnecessary, but still, sometimes it's interesting to say things. I think one of the things we need to think about with dialectics and speculation is that they may have different origins in terms of philosophical thought, but they do converge in Hegel definitely. When Hegel is using both these words, we need to see that he is in some ways trying to find a point, maybe that point may be at the point of infinity, but where these two things can find a convergence in some senses. And as we know, speculative thinking actually has its origins in this question of possibilities, this openness in that sense, dealing with counterfactuals, dealing with prefactuals in that sense. If this happens, then what happens? If that could happen, and you can see that he's using that kind of way of thinking in his phenomenal spirit all throughout in that sense, where he's trying to not only think of truth, from a ground which is given in advance. He's trying to create that ground without any prior guarantees, and that can only happen through speculative movement in some senses. So that is one side of that story. On the question of dialectics, we know dialectics has a history from, say, Daya, from, say, Daya in speech, this engagement with the two through speech in some senses, say, starting from Plato, Kant. What interestingly Hegel does is that he brings a certain retroactivity in dialectics. What it means is that dialectics always moved from, say, one to two, in that sense. But Hegel's dialectic is not that normally we put it like that. It's not that easy. Why it's not that easy is that Hegel actually also moves backwards. It moves from multiplicity back to one. That and if you look at dialectical movement in Hegel, what you get with that engagement with multiplicity is the contradiction in the one itself. Is a gap in the one itself. Isn't it? That is what this radical affirmation of the limit is actually the absolute knowledge point. And both these things actually converge for Hegel. this speculative movement, this movement which has to function without any prior grounds, without any prior guarantee in that sense, and this movement which has to find that one with that with its radical necessity, radical defaults and radical limits, from multiplicity back. And if you look at, say, if you look at Hegel's movement from, say, Lacan to Deleuze to Zizek, and that is where this retroactive creation of one has become more and more central to their thinking through this idea of real in Lacan. That you have to affirm the real, and the real exists not in between two things; it exists within the thing itself. And I think it is in that sense we can start thinking where these two, why Hegel is using both of these two things in the way he's, and I think we can have some very interesting, ways to think about it. Yeah, thanks.
No, thank you, Chetan. And as we come up on the end, if anyone has any final things to say, please do. Emilio, wonderful to see you. The question that I have that I think is part of the reason that there's a lot of confusion, or it's a kind of weird question, is, do we achieve harmony if we know there's a gap in the one? Do you achieve a kind of oneness if you know that there's a gap in the one? If you speculate, per se, that there's a gap in the one, of which is possible because of a certain dialectical thinking, what is the character of the harmony that kind of results? It's a kind of like at peace, right? But it's not a kind of at peace. And this is where it's so confusing. Because once you know about absolute knowing, there's a way in which you're harmonized with absolute knowing. And, I make that distinction in the paper on the difference between like harmony, singularity, and isolation, where there's a difference between like a unity where gaps go away and a kind of harmony that maintains difference, but is able to make, I actually use the earlier example, the symphony orchestra. The violin never becomes the piano. There is always a gap between the violin and the piano. There's always difference, and yet they're able to emerge to something that is possible precisely because of that difference. So what is the nature of the harmony that one achieves if they know there's a gap in the one? Which then I think ties into other conversations, because what is the nature of the harmony you have, say, if you're in a Garden of Eden and you don't eat from the tree? What is the kind of harmony you have when you know about the apathetic subject? What kind of harmony does the guy at the store have who has read philosophy and knows that there's a gap in the one versus someone who just works at the store? Because that gets into the risk reward of philosophy, right? What is the nature? It's kind of this tense reconciliation. It's to me, the only way I can really think about it is artistic metaphors like music or the harmony of dance, which is not pleasant. It's not easy. Like dancing is physically exhausting. Ballroom dancing will beat the crap out of you. Like I did wrestling for a bunch of years and tried ballroom, like did a ballroom dance. I was like, oh my freaking gosh. Like it doesn't mess around. And yet there is a kind of harmony in the ballroom dancing. And like doing the cello or the violin and Beethoven's Ninth is incredibly difficult. And yet there's a kind of harmony there. This is where it's so weird, because for me, as just a point, it seems like Hegel, like you say, there's a kind of meeting, but the meeting is a kind of harmony, not a kind of merging, and yet it is a kind of merging in the same way that the violin kind of merges with the piano in Beethoven's Ninth, but not quite. What is the nature of this? And so that's where I think it becomes so interesting. But with that, I will give it to Emilio, Dimitri, and then Javier, and then anyone else likes to speak before we close. And then Chetan again.
Hello, good to see everyone. I've not read Hegel, so like my understanding is very simplistic, or maybe even flat. But just a thought I want to share is that for me it's really interesting, because I think at least a dialectic, you need like in a way like opposites, right? You need to like one and an opposite of the other to reaffirm. That's maybe it is flat, but that's the way, like in a very simplistic view, the way I see it. And I find it interesting because this framework, this mental model, works in a lot of scenarios, because you have black and you have white, you have yin and you have yang, you have sun and you have night. Like in nature, this pattern of like opposites is very, very common. So it makes sense to use it when trying to understand something or the nature of thing. Like this is a computer because it is not a chair, right? So I see the usefulness in that, but also I think like I find it interesting when there's no reference point, in the sense that, for example, in Avatar, like the animated series, you have 4 elements. You have water, you have air, you have earth, and you have fire. And fire and air are kind of opposites in the same that fire is like very aggressive and earth is very chill and water like very fluid and earth and like very hard, right? So you have like this matrix of like things that relate to one another, and the relationships between these things make sense, right? Like one is the opposite of another, they complement, maybe like water and air complement themselves. Like we have this really nice matrix of things. But then you go to a movie like Frozen, and I have not seen it, like Frozen 2, and I have not seen it in a while, but I remember, and because it felt weird, it felt wrong, that like the elements of the movie were like fire, water, I don't know, earth, and then ice. And you're like, wait a minute, like an element is ice, like it does, like ice is just water, right? Like this doesn't make sense. Like it's not an opposite, it's not like it like a composite, like it doesn't make sense in like the relations with the other things. So just so for me this is the thing, that some things like you can say like, oh, okay, like this is fire because it's the opposite of the values of air, right? So you can make that distinction and you can deepen your understanding of fire in that way. But sometimes you go to something that's like completely new, and of course in that newness you can find your different opposites, and you can work through there. But there are some things that cannot, I think at least, that don't make sense to equate them in this opposite kind of thinking. So I just that's just a thought that I had that was interesting, because a lot of philosophers, I think, like use this like nothingness and being something, and they like this, it's always this binary, like you are or you aren't. And I think like you can get very, very far thinking that way. But I think that if, just like a thought experiment, if you were forced to not use like this distinction of being and not being, how would you describe the world? How would you view it? Maybe you would view it as a series of, I don't know, interactions or something. Just a thought. But I think that the thought that would rise from this limitation of not being able to have this dialectic or these opposites would be interesting. So that was just the thing I wanted to say. And yeah.
Emilio, I agree with you with what you said on the. You have three elements, right? You have earth, fire, water, and then you have ice, the fourth. What the heck? The way I agree with you, to bring another concrete example, is the fact that woman doesn't make sense. You know, what's a woman? Well, a woman is a symptom of a man. That's what Jacques Lacan said. And Jacques Lacan had this theory of the three registers in which your psyche takes in reality. The symbolic, the real, and the imaginary. Now, the real is kind of special because it actually breaks their symbolic and imaginary apart. But there's also another thing happening here, because there is a fourth register that doesn't really fit in with the other three, and this is the symptom. So it kind of relates to what you were saying, and I think, you know, they're thinking in triads. Like a lot of times there can be kind of like an excess which attaches itself to the triad in a parasitical way. Just to go back to your point, Daniel. So it's very confusing, everything that's happening here, and I think that this is why Hegel ultimately is also a thinker of freedom. Because I will just read a quote again, like this dogmatic Hegelian is always doing. He says, "Freedom exists only where there is no other for me that is not myself. The natural human being, who is determined only by his urges, is not at home with himself. However self-willed he may be, the content of his willing and believing is still not his own, and his freedom is merely a formal one. When I think, I give up my subjective particularity, immerse myself in the basic matter, and let thought follow its own course. And I think badly whenever I add something of my own." So spirit for Hegel is at home with itself in the singular universality of thought. This also harks back to what we were talking about before, where if you want to be like the most universal, it doesn't mean that you're the most abstract. It doesn't mean that you're talking about, you know, the global world and whatever kind of abstract scale, where you're actually talking about something extremely singular. And this is also, I think, the nature of forgiveness, you know, and where you actually give in. You know, you say, I am lacking, and then the other can also say, I am also lacking, and this is the end of the spirit chapter in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. You know, when we're dealing with things like this in our life, like when there's someone else who is lacking or you are lacking, the other at the other end seems to be substantial, you know. But that's actually the moment that you have to relinquish this substance so you can actually talk on a common playing field, you know, so you can actually not talk down to them. Actually, it's very simple in that sense. So that's, yeah, this notion is I think what Hegel basically said in that quote contains the answer to what you were getting at. But also there's this problem of embodiment. And now you can go multiple ways here. You can think Hegel as the best embodied thinker because it's all about the concreteness of actuality. But maybe it's not the case like this. Maybe he was struggling with being embodied. And this is why he went to the books and to the writing, into his own room, you know, with his pencil, trying to work out his system. Of course, then this is some kind of external idea to that. But yeah, this is something to think about, definitely.
Okay, I got to bring up Buber, right? Because if Dimitri brings up Hegel, I got to bring up Buber. He's like, yeah, Daniel's like, yeah, bring up Buber. So, you know, Buber, he actually always has a problem with now, Dimitri, I know you talked about Hegel as like a mystic, right? One of Buber's main critiques about mysticism and like mystics, right, is this sort of unification going on. And I think you even get this sort of distaste from Nishida as well. But I just want to talk about it because it brings up like a nice opposition, right? Buber doesn't like the idea that he doesn't. I think he's very much against the mystics' notions of God's radical oneness. Because if that's the case, then just to bring up Nishida, if you say God is an individual and that's all there is, that's not really an individual because you only know individual from other to be contrasted by. You need an other in order to say that thing is an individual. The same thing, you need an other to say that thing is a singularity. So Nishida comes up with the idea that actually you need absolute contradictories. Like that's what it is. It's just called an absolute contradictory. And Buber seems to be in the same of this realm, that we have to always stay in relation. It seems like for Buber, if I were to say anything, he is the man of absolute relation, rather than saying like Nishida's absolute nothingness or Hegel's like absolute knowing. It's like absolute relation, that the feeling that the mystic has, like with the unification of God, Buber simply calls as the relation itself, that is actually not a unification, but simply, you seeing it basically calls it love, right? Love sort of erases that boundaries, but he's saying like because it feels like it erases that boundaries doesn't mean it's actually true. It seems like that's Buber's critique, and he's very adamant about this idea of absorption that we seem to be talking about when we refer to mysticism and so on. It seems like both my favorite thinkers, Buber and Iqbal, were very strong critics of mysticism. but yeah, I just want to bring that in as sort of just like Buber's critique of just, this thing. And then like Daniel talked about the gap in the one, and I think I brought this up before, which I always like Freud's kind of explanation of dreams on this. Like when you're experiencing a dream and there seems to be a gap in the memory of your dream, that the gap itself is actually a part of the dream. So I've always loved that explanation. So if there is a gap in the one, that is also still part of the one. That's what it is. What is the nature of the gap in the one? It's a good question, Daniel. It makes me, and this is a question that I want to ask because I think this will be a funny question to ask, mainly because in my class, I learned about like Japanese the Japanese started changing their schools of thought because they thought the Mappo was coming, the end of time that it takes for enlightenment, is that time is degrading so much that actually we get further away from reaching enlightenment. We no longer have the time to reach enlightenment ourselves. So then the age of Mappo is like where basically we can only just be succumb to like Buddha's grace, right? So my question is, in a philosophical sense, when we talk about, I know a lot of thought has been talking about philosophy and using philosophy to sort of solve problems. My funny take would be, is it already too late for philosophy? Or is philosophy already in an age of Mappo, which brings up the problem of grace again? But I also think, in my opinion, I think those that cognize philosophy is, the people already doing it. And so I'm starting to think that for the layman, I don't think is ever going to be able to cognize the absolute. So there must be some type of avenue, some type of path for the layman. And the way I describe layman, and I want to make this very clear about the way I describe layman. The layman is not somebody I consider dumb or cannot do it necessarily. It's possible that they can cognize, but the thing is, they have conditions restraining them that deter them from the ability to cognize the absolute. So what is then the solution to the layman that is confined by conditions to have a response towards reality? This is where I started speculating the idea of like micro-dialectics, right? Like you cannot be the man thinking about onto-epistemology. You simply do not have time to really think that all through. So this is why I started to like thinking of like maybe there's a dialectic for the layman that so can kind of prevent some type of trapping that Daniel brings up. But yeah, just let me know what you guys think about that. Yeah. So
I'll just go back to, I think, Daniel's question. If anybody wants to respond to Javier's question, you can do that before actually, because I'll I wanted to sort of respond to that question of harmony and the gap. And I think that's a very fascinating kind of a problem, which, as I said, which we started from also when we were discussing art and music. We were discussing this contiguity, this problem that art always involves keeping two things which are not of the same order together. And actually, music in some rhythm, in some sense, emerges from that contiguity. If two things are meant to be together, it's not art. Art always involves keeping two things which are in some sense not meant to be together in its relational sense. And yet it finds, so you can find a word like non-relational relations, which appear in art in some sense, in music, and and when those two things come together, you realize, oh, they were always meant to be there. There is always that idea that this was always meant to be happening. This was always meant to be seen. It's just that we did not see it before, in some sense, And then we start thinking about in what forms or in what ways a harmony of this nature emerge. And I think one kind of an answer always has been that, this unity actually exists in the God's mind. We just can't know it, and that also gives us a certain radical outsideness. But if we start probing that question of what form of relation exists, and we start coming from, say, Kant to Hegel. Kant in itself is not a speculative thinker. Kant is somebody who has, this idea of a transcendental, position. But even Kant, this unity that happens, that we bring to something, in some senses, even if it's coming from transcendental position, it is a unity that actually you are bringing to the object. That relation is something that you are bringing to the object from a certain, and it is there that we find the relevance of the gap. And in Hegel, of course, that gap itself becomes the point from which the thing has to be cognized, the thing has to be grasped. It's not that's not something simply outside in that sense. So when then we start thinking that it is in that affirmation of the gap itself that this kind of harmony actually emerges. And just to sort of think further on, this is a fairly obvious point. It should not surprise us, but there are some implications of it which can actually be interesting for some of us. One is that when we actually radically engage with that gap is not simply a gap which gives us only emptiness. it also creates forms of unity for us, which is why unity is very important for Hegel. It creates forms or new forms of unity. Unity in that sense is not an end point of that cycle. Unity is the point from which that gap becomes available to us. In some senses, unity is the ground from which that gap, then that's something which I try to think through this question of intensity in my own paper in Nietzsche. That is the intensive dimension. That's what I was trying to sort of think through. The other is that when you start thinking about, in some senses, this form of relationship, this harmony actually emerges not through two things being directly in relation to one another only. This harmony also emerges from both of things finding a relationship back to each other also, back to themselves also, through the other. So there's always a relationship back to yourself through another, in some senses. And how do we think through that dynamic? That you need an other to actually understand yourself better. The other is there in some senses to find, and what kind of harmony emerges from this kind of dynamic, where the other is not there to simply tell you who you are, but it is through it that you can find a way to, think about yourself and understand yourself and understand that gap and affirm that gap in some senses. And I think I'll just, thank you.
Anyone else have anything? As always, it is a delight and a pleasure to have all you fine people. So a few things. One, it's interesting to note on the point of Lacan and woman that the feminine has had a tradition of being symbolic of the apathetic, which would be a full reality that cannot be captured by the logos drunk male. And so that's kind of one of the ways when you associate, say, the female with nothing, or there is no such as female, there's a way which you can also associate that with a tradition where the feminine is always a mystery, but mystery is not something you cannot know, but something that, as you know, there's more to know. And so it's a super saturated phenomenon that you get that is kind of, I think, helpful. So a few things. One, if I were to use my language again to kind of discuss Hegel, for me, a way I think about it is the phenomenology of spirit is the process where one comes to realize that the true isn't the rational, that there is a division, and then there's a movement, but then that leaves two questions that I would then associate with speculative reasoning. There's the question of, well, then how the heck do you select a truth? And two, what is the logic by which truth and rationality interact? So there's a meta level that then you have to engage in. So there's kind of that movement from the realization at absolute knowing that the true isn't the rational, and then the question of how those two should relate if they're not equivalent to one another, which you're stuck in rationality to use, right? Oh, that's kind of weird. So there's this rising and falling element. Also, it is not possible for a human being to understand something as, say, a pure becoming, right? So you need to understand it in the category of being. But for Hegel, pure being is nothingness, right? So there's all these very strange turns, self-devouring paradoxes that one has to think through. But what is the logic of that thinking through? What is the nature of that thinking through? And this is where you start looking on, well, how is a poem written? How is art done? What is the logic of these things? Because maybe there's something analogous by which we can look at to try to determine what is going on there. To Dimitri's point on freedom, there seems to be a very big difference between freedom from and freedom in. There seems to be the freedom from limitation and then the freedom that is found in limitation. And Hegel seems to play with those quite well. I really like how this is brought out at the beginning of the philosophy of right, actually, where at the beginning, I make a distinction between determination and necessity there. I'm not saying that's his language, but for me, a determination is, say, you find yourself determined by your genes, right? So you're just kind of forced to. If you can come to the place where you identify with your genes, though, then it becomes a necessity, meaning you had to have some genes, but it's no longer something that you don't identify with, where it's a pure determinant just kind of pulling you along. And that language, as I'm talking, Hegel later will talk about determinate being, so I may need to switch those terms in the paper, but let me think about that later on. So anyway, but and also this is interesting too, and I'll tie this in. I was just speaking with Mr. Raymond Owen on a wonderful book that nobody reads called The Triumph of the Therapeutic by Philip Reith. And I think it's a magnificent book. Actually, reading it inspired Belonging again, which is an attempt at the psychohistorical process, the theory of psychohistorical process that he said needed to be written. But basically, Philip Reith wants to say that what has happened with the loss of, say, religion, demanding, I actually think in this book, it basically predicts the meaning. It actually predicts basically everything before anyone. Nobody read it. It's really unfortunate. But anyway, where he says it's impossible now in a social order to find freedom in the social order, The only definition of freedom we have is freedom from a social order. But you see, that leads to a lot of chaos, because that means you have pure freedom. And when you have that, you have a pure encounter of Lacan's the real. You don't have any sort of ventilation system. And there's no givens, there's only releases, is the way I describe it. And this creates all sorts of fun. So what you need, what Philip Rieff will say, and this is also the balance of the reality principle, pleasure principle, so on and so on in Freud, is that we find our freedom in a certain harmonization with things that are given, but not so given that they're oppressive. And you find some sort of peace almost, if you will, with that. And that pure freedom is a freedom in that balance. And balance is a tricky word, but if you grant it to me here, this is all quite difficult stuff. What's very interesting, a reason why I've gotten so interesting in Hegel, so Philip Rieff was back in 2016, is that Hegel gives you a way in which thought realizes on its own, paying attention to itself, if you will, that there is a certain absolute knowing that may be possible to function as a given now, that we can find freedom in as opposed to freedom from, thus addressing the problems of the triumph of the therapeutic in a society of pure release. Because if you come to say, oh, thinking itself following thinking dialectically ends up at a point of absolute knowing, where then you engage in speculative reasoning of what exactly that means, that one thinks dialectically, then this seems like it may have a possibility of functioning as the givens that, Philip Rieff talks about. So that's something I'm very interested in. The closing point that I will make that helps me think about this as well, to what Chitan was saying and on all of this is freedom. When you are in a dance, or let's say a jazz improv, but I'm going to use dance today because, you know, I want to spice it up with a different artistic phenomenological experience. When you are in a dance and you really are lost in the dance, you feel totally free, like you've practiced, you've done all the work, you've habituated yourself where you have the flow state, right? You feel a kind of bliss, a kind of freedom in that flow state that is only possible because of the difference between you and the person you're dancing with, or the other people, right? The flow emerges precisely because you are not everything, right? Like if you get in the flow state of writing a book, it's because the book doesn't exist yet. There's a thing outside of you that you are interacting with that makes it possible to find the freedom of the flow state. And here's the funny question. When you're in a dance and you're really lost, or a jazz improv, or whatever media you want, there's a feeling of freedom. There's a feeling of, oh, that's good. The kind of a mutual determination, different things, Javier, and different things. But there's a kind of harmony between you and that person. You find the freedom. So here's the question. Okay, between you and that person right there on the dance floor, are you one? Are you different? Are you harmonized, or are you not? This is what I would posit to you. Practically speaking, you are harmonized. You're kind of the same, but you're kind of one, practically speaking. Technically, you are not one, right? Here's, I think, Hegel's brilliant move. This is a claim that I would throw out. Hegel's move would say that the practical is more real than the technical. We tend to think the technical is the more real. We say technically they're not one, while practically they are. The flip is, no, the practical is more real than the technical. And technical is the realm of dialectical thinking. The practical is the realm of speculative reasoning, because the moment you think about the dance, you're back in the technical and you've lost the practical. And how does one speculatively reason about the practical when to reason is to engage in the technical? And that's the tension. But if we understand that the practical in the dance is more real than the technical, well, then we can start to see how a harmony might be possible, even if that harmony sets limits on what the technical can know and understand. So that's one way I would approach it. But with that, my friends, I must make a run to the grocery store. It is always a pleasure. Thank you. I've always enjoyed this very much. Thank you. Y'all have a wonderful day. Mr. Jockin, it's wonderful to see you again. Your students are lucky to have you. Bless you all. Thank you all for being here. It's always a delight. It's a delight. Thank you all.